Hey, I'm James Lankford. It's great to be able to be with you again for another episode of The Breakdown with James Lankford. This is where we try to take the things you see on the national news that they cover in 30 seconds and to be able to bring it down to a little deeper level, have a deeper conversation. This conversation today is on China. It's an issue that we talk about, and a lot of people talk about Chinese economy, we talk about Chinese trade, we talk about Chinese military, we talk about Taiwan, but often people throw those terms around but can't really go deeper than that. We're going to try to take this a little bit deeper as we go through this conversation today. If you're tracking us on this single episode, great. Welcome to the conversation on this. We do put this out in a subscription mode. If you want to know when the next episode is coming up on the next big topic, you can always subscribe to us at all the major platforms for podcasting, whether it be iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, whatever it may be. You can go to any of those and subscribe to The Breakdown with James Lankford. Today, as I mentioned before, we're talking about China, and we're talking with a China expert. It is Matt Pottinger. Matt has been a leader on these issues and has been one to be able to study, write, research on the issues of China. He was the China expert in the Trump administration that was actually developing the policy to be able to put in place what are we going to do with this great power challenge of China. Very few people that I know that I bump into on the street just can speak Mandarin fluently, or to get a chance to talk about Chinese philosophy and ancient philosophy as well as current things, or can pick up a newspaper and it can explain what's in a Chinese newspaper, why it's there, except for Matt. You're one of those leaders that's not only you know it, you've studied it, you've experienced these issues on the policy side, on the cultural side, on the human rights side. You've had this passion for a very long time, and we're very grateful to be able to pick your brain, to be able to go a little bit deeper. Quite frankly, there are business leaders all over the country that pick your brain all the time about China. We're grateful to get a little bit of time with you as well, to be able to also pick your brain, to be able to determine what's going on with China. So, Matt, thanks so much for joining us today on The Breakdown.
Thanks, Senator Lankford. It's really great to see you. A fan of your show, and it's great to be talking about China with you.
Well, glad to be able to do it. So let's set some context on this. When we talk about China, some people talk about China and they have this perception of, oh, yeah, China's a great power. They're a little different. They're just a country that's bigger than ours, but we do trade with them. They do trade with us. We watch the Olympics. Everyone looked like they were in a good mood. They have tourists that come over to the United States. We have professors that are here with different exchanges with China. So some people look at it on a very generic turn. And then you question, you push it a little deeper, and you say, China's a communist government. Are you aware of that? Do you know what that means? So when you set the context to people that are even business people considering doing business with 1 billion people in China, and you try to explain when you step into China, you need to understand this about them philosophically, how they're structured as a country. How do you start setting the context for people?
I like the way that you framed it. China is anything but a generic power or generic country. It is one of the last remaining Leninist dictatorships that survived through the end of the Cold War. And at the end of the Cold War, 30 years ago, after the Soviet Union collapsed, we thought that it was probably only going to be a matter of time before those last remaining Leninist, nominally communist countries would, matter of time before they would have to start to liberalize, open up their economies, and over time, we hope, democratize a little bit, if not a lot. But we miscalculated in the case of China. We really underestimated the will and capability of the Chinese Communist Party to cling to power at any cost. And so when we talk about a rising China, we're not talking about the rise of another democracy. We're not talking about a sort of generic sort of rise in that sense. We're talking about a country that's becoming less free over time, less market-oriented in its economics, and also less consensus-driven and much more driven by the dictates of one man, one human being, and that, of course, is the Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Yeah. So when you think about the Chinese people, again, the Chinese are excellent at PR, basically, putting out smiling individuals and saying, here's what we're really like. But when you look into the Chinese nation and the nation of China and the Chinese people that are out there, kind of paint the picture for me of what we're actually dealing with. Because you talk about rural Chinese and urban Chinese, or those that are actually in Chinese leadership, they're in a very different role in this spot. So kind of walk us through what it's like to be a Chinese citizen at this point, whether it's human rights issues or whether it's just basic economy.
Chinese people are great. I spent 9 years in China. over the course of my earlier adulthood, and really loved living there. I loved Chinese people. But when the Chinese government gets out of the way of the Chinese people a little bit, like it was doing in sort of the 1980s, and then again in the 90s or into the early 2000s, you see people expressing that sort of entrepreneurial gene and engaging with the world. The problem is the Chinese Communist Party is not getting out of the way of the Chinese people anymore, the way that it was beginning to do under Deng Xiaoping, the leader who ruled roughly from the 1980s and 1990s till his death in 1997. They're reasserting themselves. The Chinese Communist Party, this ruling party, is reasserting itself into the daily lives of all people, into the economy, and they're using high technology to intrude on people's lives in ways that were unthinkable by 20th century dictatorships. They're able to monitor everything that people buy, what they write, what they're shopping for, what they're looking at and reading online, and where they're going. And the Chinese government is trying to create and is beginning to succeed at creating this system that they call Skynet, which, without any irony, you and I remember the Terminator films, from the 1980s, and Skynet. They're building it, and they're actually using the same name. They're ingesting all of this data and trying to predict people's behavior, and also to anticipate any criticism or resistance to the party and its goals. So if you're disloyal to those goals, they find out and they pay you a visit, or they pay your family members a visit. If you're living overseas, the security apparatus will call your parents and tell them that they want to meet because they're concerned with things that you're writing or reading when you're living abroad in the United States, as Chinese students are confronting that situation right now. We're confronting a very different kind of problem and adversary than what we expected when we embarked on this engagement policy and continued it through the end of the Cold War.
So their goal is not just managing their own citizens, though, and to be able to make sure that people don't say negative things. Obviously, you can't be a free journalist in China. They control all media there. They control the messaging. The internet doesn't come into China the way that it does everywhere else. They manage their own social media platforms that they run. They're gathering information. And if you want to be able to have interchange with a Chinese citizen, that's going to be very, very controlled, managed, watched, or eliminated entirely. They just can't go to the web the way that an American could to be able to go to any site anywhere. There are certain limitations that are put on Chinese citizens, but that's not just about Chinese citizens. The Chinese Communist government also has goals that extend worldwide. You'll hear the term in the public arena about the Belt and Road Initiative. What is that? What are they trying to actually accomplish worldwide, not just among the billion citizens in China?
Yeah, and to your first point, you're right. They've harnessed the internet to monitor people's behavior in ways that we did not anticipate. You remember during the Clinton administration, President Clinton memorably said that China is going to have a lot of trouble controlling the internet and people on the internet. He said it'll be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, the Communist Party has succeeded in nailing Jell-O to the wall. Like you said, they control the entire environment. They do not allow Twitter and Facebook and other overseas apps and news sites in. They've expelled most U.S. journalists. They've arrested a lot of Chinese journalists who used to be able to write relatively freely, at least about business, if not about politics. So it's a very different environment. It's much less free than it was when I was living in China 20 years ago, working as a reporter there. The Belt and Road Initiative, what the Chinese, in Chinese, it's called One Belt, One Road. And it's a metaphor and a strategy. The metaphor is that they're building a maritime road to the Mediterranean Sea, and they're building a land road, like an old Silk Road, all the way to Europe over the Eurasian continent. And China wants to control all of the stations of that road and sort of the standards and trade of those routes. But what it really is in practice is in an effort to gain, to really co-opt, and in some cases corrupt leaders in developing countries around the world by offering them large loans. And there are often kickbacks associated with those loans. Those kickbacks go to the leaders who accept the loans. But the loans from the Chinese government are nominally to build new infrastructure, build ports, build highways, and telecommunications infrastructure. In practice, the loans are far bigger than these countries are able to take on or repay. And so the countries almost invariably end up defaulting on those loans. And then the Chinese government says, oh, you're defaulting, so it's time for us to read the fine print of those contracts we had you sign. The contracts are all secret, by the way. They're known only to the leaders who sign them, although we've gotten our hands on about 100 of these contracts. And they are deeply corrupt, highly problematic agreements that allow the Chinese government to take control of those countries' infrastructure when the countries are unable to repay the loans. And that's why you've seen the Chinese government take over for 99 years a dual-use, potential military port in Sri Lanka, just off the coast of India. It's why the airport in Uganda has now been taken over by the Chinese government, because the Ugandan government made the colossal mistake of signing an agreement that they were never going to be able to upheld, ever be able to repay. And so China is taking control of ports and infrastructure all over the world: Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Islands, Central Asia, Africa, and so on. So it's really sort of a neo-colonial model. The British Empire was built through the use of gunboat diplomacy, but also the very deft sort of co-opting of elites in countries. China's sort of taking a play from the old 18th century British playbook, except they're using debt diplomacy rather than gunboat diplomacy to achieve.
So Matt, what's the goal there? What are they trying to accomplish?
What they want is for governments to start using Chinese currency. They want influence over the leaders so that they can get those leaders to support China's policy agenda, which is, in shorthand, China's ultimate aim is to render the United States irrelevant. They just want us to be irrelevant in the future as a power, and they want the world to be safe for autocracy. And so that's what they're doing. They're building these little sort of partnerships with corrupted elites, co-opted elites in foreign countries, so that China can base their military in those countries. China has ambitions you may have been reading about. It was something that we were trying to prevent in the last administration. I know that the Biden administration is also trying to prevent China from gaining access to build a naval base on the Atlantic Ocean, okay, not just in the Pacific. China wants to, they have global ambitions, and we're starting to see that unfold now.
So where the United States, what we say is our greatest export is freedom. We have a lot of things we export out of the country economically, but our greatest export is really freedom. When we move into countries, and our diplomatic relationships are really designed to be able to set the people of that country free. If they don't have a free press, if they don't have freedom of religion, if they don't have freedom of speech, if they don't have opportunity to be able to make their choices, to have entrepreneurship and to be able to rise, that country will continue to be oppressed. And the people of that country are oppressed. We're always pushing back to try to free people around the world and to have more engagement in their own government. The Chinese government's really the opposite. They're teaching dictators around the world how to be better dictators, how to have a better surveillance system in their country, how to be able to manage their people as they do in the communist government. Literally, their greatest export is control and trying to be able to manage control. And we're seeing them move through Africa and through multiple other countries, literally equipping dictators with the tools needed to be able to control their people while we're trying to be able to help set people free in this process. So it's not just the United States economy against the American economy. It is really two sets of ideas. Is the world going to be dominated by a few people controlling the many, or is the world going to be dominated by a free people being able to speak out and to be able to live their lives and to choose that? That's the American system versus the Chinese system. So sometimes this gets broken down into, well, America has bases all over the world. What's the big deal about that? America, engages in diplomacy all over the world. What's the big deal about that? There's an enormous philosophical difference with a world that's dominated by China and its values, or the world dominated by the United States and our values of freedom on that. So that's really these two competing ideologies that are out there. Now, we see it a lot in trade, but we also see it in military engagement. As you mentioned, it's not just trade in ports and airports, but they're actually moving militarily around the world in a way that we've not seen China do 20 years ago, 30 years ago. They are now. What are you seeing in the military expansion for China?
Well, I couldn't have put it any better. You put your finger on it. We're exporting freedom. China's exporting control. We're trying to help governments maintain their sovereignty and independence. China wants to build a sphere of influence with a new hierarchical sensibility, more like the empires of old, where countries are subordinate to the big power. And the China's military buildup is a big component in service of China's aims. Now, the Chinese military now spends more money, and this is just according to their published budget. There's a lot of other spending that's sort of hidden in R&D and other budgets, but just the published top line figure is more than the rest of Asia's militaries combined. So more than Japan and South Korea, North Korea, India, and all the 10 Southeast Asian nations, including Indonesia. China's spending more than all of them combined, and they're acquiring capabilities, high-tech capabilities, that are designed to keep the United States away from Asia, to give China a free hand to do things like annex Taiwan through military force and capture the South China Sea, which is a massive ocean. It's a waterway that trillions of dollars of world trade pass through each year, and also to intimidate Japan and Southeast Asian countries, and then ultimately to go beyond that. So we're dealing with a real juggernaut. This was a military that 20 years ago did not have the capability to make the sorts of threats that have now suddenly become credible because they poured so many resources into building up that military capability. And again, the focus right now is on their neighborhood. Namely, they want to capture Taiwan, which is the world's first Chinese democracy, the Republic of China on Taiwan. The very existence of a democracy, no matter how small, there's only 24 million people in Taiwan. It's like a equivalent to a mid-sized or small province in China. Yet the existence of that democracy is a threat to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party because it's an example of individuals ruling themselves and choosing the government that they want, enjoying the freedoms afforded by a rule of law and a constitution. So they're focused on extinguishing democracy in Taiwan, and from there, that would be the lily pad to project power deep into the Pacific Ocean, to our coasts, to cut off access to Australia and New Zealand and Pacific Islands. And then in the other direction, they want to move into the Indian Ocean, up into the Mediterranean, and on eventually to the Atlantic. So the military is a key component of their strategy.
Yeah, so this term gets thrown around a one China policy, that actually involves obviously Taiwan, but we also saw that with Hong Kong. You know that very well from being there so many times. Hong Kong, if you went back just 3 years ago, was a free area with a free press and free religion and all the freedoms that were there, and an agreement from China that will be maintained that. But within a few years' time period, they were able to shift and then take over and then subordinate Hong Kong, where now they don't have a free press anymore. Now they don't have the opportunity to be able to have freedom of religion. Now they've cut that off, which a lot of people said they'll never do because that will cut off their economy. Why would they cut off this engine in their economy to be able to take away freedoms from Hong Kong? But clearly freedom is a threat to a communist government. So, what have we learned from what they did in Hong Kong to what we may see coming with Taiwan in the days ahead? And why does that matter to somebody in the United States? Why should we care what happens to Taiwan? That seems like a Pacific issue. If the Chinese claim Taiwan, why should we care that if they go just take over that, as you said, small island that's there with 24 million people in it?
Well, like you mentioned, China signed a treaty. Not just a piece of paper, but a treaty registered with the United Nations, signed between the United Kingdom and China, that said that China will respect a high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong and abide by a formula the Chinese dreamt up called one country, two systems. In other words, when the British handed over Hong Kong in '97, Beijing said that as a precondition, they would ensure that Hong Kong would still enjoy its own customs, its own courts, its own rule of law, including freedom of religion, freedom of the press. I mean, it was an incredible, thriving society. I lived there for a few years, even after the British handover. But China violated, completely disregarded that treaty when it started to sign a law in 2019 that basically abrogated and superseded all of Hong Kong's own constitution. And now they have stamped out many of those freedoms. They're crushing the freedoms of the individual. They're dismantling the rule of law, and it's really they're dictating rules there and strangling the golden goose, right? So one thing it taught us is that China's word is not worth spit, but it also showed us that China is willing to do self-harm. It's willing to damage its own economy and the prospects of its own economic advancement for its own people in order to ensure that there are no challenges of any type to the Communist Party's authority. So it is a paranoid dictatorship. And that matters for Americans because Americans sign contracts. Americans do business. We sell agriculture. We export machinery and other things to China. Those agreements are not worth the paper they're written on. China agreed with the Trump administration in 2020 that it would significantly increase its agricultural purchases. We just heard from the Biden administration that China did not keep up their end of the deal. They only bought about 60% of what they had promised. Now, for Taiwan, if Taiwan were to fall to a military action by the People's Republic of China, we would wake up in a very different world. This would be, even more serious than the situation that's erupted in Europe over Ukraine and the outrageous threats to Ukraine's sovereignty by Russia. The consequences of Taiwan falling would mean that the U.S. economy would lose access potentially to most of the world's supply of high-end semiconductors. Our economy, about a third of our economy, is tied to high-end semiconductors. So we would start going backwards in time. It would have a very significant impact on our electronics industry, our innovation economy. It would also threaten Japan in ways that would really provoke an emergency in Japan, in South Korea, and among the Southeast Asian democracies. Given that Taiwan, if it fell, that would really capsize the whole defensive concept for protecting Japan. All of its defenses oriented west. Taiwan fell, it means that China is really outflanking Japan and would be able to threaten blockades and the like. So we would probably see the spread of nuclear weapons, as many countries would scramble to try to arm themselves with some kind of a deterrent against China. We would see emergencies that would threaten democracy in all of those great maritime republics and other nations throughout the Western Pacific, and it would cut off the United States and our access to the biggest markets in the world, but also the supply of semiconductors and electronics to our system. So it'd be an extremely, extremely disruptive event. We'd wake up in a new era.
Yeah, the supply chain runs through Taiwan. We've seen right now the availability of cars, for instance, of new cars. And everybody will say, well, there's no new cars in the supply chain. They'll say, well, aren't those assembled here in the United States or assembled in North America? They are. but they've got this little semiconductor that comes from Taiwan, and if that doesn't occur, none of the functionality of that vehicle actually happens. We don't actually have a supply chain challenge with cars more than we have a supply chain challenge on getting semiconductors. If all of that gets cut off from Taiwan in an instant, literally, whether it's your iPhone or whether it is a vehicle or whatever device that it may be, anything that does something electronically has a semiconductor in it. We don't produce the majority of those. We have overseas suppliers, and most of those are in Taiwan. And we lose all that. We lose all that technology and that availability literally in a day. And China seems to be extremely aware of that, and very, very focused on what they can do to the rest of the world if only they took over Taiwan.
It's exactly right. And it's why I think that we need to bring manufacturing back to the United States. We used to be the leaders in manufacturing high-end semiconductors. We're still the best in the world at designing them. But if you don't make them, over time, your ability even to design the chips will erode. America's industrial rise and the rise of our digital age was really benefited from the fact that we were manufacturing in the United States, because people who were doing the theoretics and doing the designs could actually work inside of fabs, inside of factories, to learn about the materials that are being used, to learn about the constraints, but also the new possibilities that are available given the engineering that takes place with all the tooling and manufacturing. So it's important to bring some of that back.
Yeah, it matters. You brought up one issue earlier, and it has to be, unfortunately, the last issue we talk about. There's literally a billion things we could talk about with China, but we don't have time to be able to cover all those. But I do want to cover one thing that some people don't pay attention to much, and that's the relationship between China and Russia. I describe them as frenemies because they don't get along until they do get along, and then they find ways to cooperate and they find ways to be able to fight. A lot of Americans just look at Russia and China and just say, well, they're allies and they get along, but they don't always, and there's a unique dynamic there. And as you mentioned before, and what's happening with Russia and Ukraine at this moment while we're talking, makes us pay attention to what's happening in Russia, but knowing that the Chinese government is also watching how the United States engages with Ukraine, just like they watch the United States and what happened in Afghanistan and our horrible retreat withdrawal that actually happened there. The whole world watched the weakness of the United States. As they watch Ukraine, there are also the people of Taiwan are thinking, what happens next? But this very unique relationship between Russia and China, if you can help us just get some context there and some history.
No, you said frenemies is not a bad way to think about it, because you've got these two big powers. They're both really empires that share a massively long border, and over recent centuries, they have fought against each other. They've taken territory from one another and fought a bitter, short conflict. Even in the modern era, in the late 1950s, they had a split between the Soviet Union and China because partly because of ideological differences, but also because of territorial disputes. So I like to say that this is a real sort of alliance that Putin and Xi Jinping are building, but it is a top-down one. It's one at the leader level and one that's being imposed on their two systems. But if you go down a few levels and talk to bureaucrats in each of those systems, there's still a significant degree of mistrust between China and Russia. There's still a lot of reasons why they don't believe that they make natural allies, but they do make opportunistic allies at this particular moment because they have a common foe in the United States. Right. And it's again, just like I was saying about Taiwan, the mere existence of the United States is a problem for both of those dictators. And so there's no amount of appeasement or pacification or favors that we can offer, concessions that we can make that would ultimately make Russia and China feel at ease. The truth is there's no amount of concessions that would make them feel at ease, because the mere existence of a democracy as the world's most powerful country is a threat to their legitimacy, and therefore they are taking up the opportunity to try to coordinate in creating problems for free countries, Russia facing westward into Europe, China facing eastward into the Pacific, they view that as sort of a force multiplier. If they can keep us distracted and tied up with problems, those two dictators will benefit from the actions each are taking.
Yeah, it's just something we as Americans don't think about all the time. Most Americans don't get up and think, the rest of the world hates our freedom. We love our freedom, enjoy our freedom. We wish more people had the opportunity to be able to have our freedom. And so we're always pushing that value out to say, allow individuals to be able to make free choices, because as you give opportunities for free choices, there's lots of opportunities there for an entire community. They wake up every day saying there's chaos and I need to fix it by dominating people that are free. And so they can't stand our mere existence at that point because of what we stand for and what we're all about. For some reason, Americans seem to get that when we talk about Islamic terrorism and people trying to be able to dominate us in some of those areas around the Middle East, and to be able to say we're going to dominate this American perspective of too much freedom. But when you think about China, oftentimes we think, oh, they seem like nice people. I don't think that's what they're really trying to do. They're just a lot more subtle in the way they're addressing that, becoming less and less subtle over the last couple of years as China's become more and more blunt, and they're forced to be able to say, we're going to dominate this Western perspective. We're going to put aside all this chaos that the West brings and bring order to everything by our own control. We as Americans do have to awaken to that, whether you're doing a business relationship with individual in China, whether you're considering doing manufacturing in China and shipping back to the United States. People will learn pretty quickly when that's convenient for the Chinese Communist government. They like it. When it's not convenient, they'll shut it down in an instant. And it becomes its own unique challenge to be able to deal with a government that is very different than our own, both on how they supervise you, how they own your intellectual property, how they manage the day-to-day workforce, and how they control everybody in the process. So it is a very different experience for them, as it is for us. And it is an awakening for us to be able to think about that more.
That is exactly right. You look at the example of Australia, the Australians were exporting almost 40% of their exports were going to China. The Chinese government one day woke up, decided they wanted to punish Australia because Australia had proposed an investigation to find out the origins of COVID. So China started cutting off, all sorts of exports, beef and coal and seafood. And the Australians, to their credit, did not back down to Chinese demands, and ultimately they found new markets. And actually, the Australian economy, as a result, is more resilient today than it was 2 years ago, because now they have a much more diversified export base. They were able to find and develop new markets. Many of the new markets that they developed are in societies that actually enjoy the rule of law, so you have some recourse if the government or if your purchaser decides that they want to violate the terms of agreement. You still have recourse. There is no recourse in a Leninist dictatorship as practiced under the Chinese Communist Party. There just isn't.
And by the way, the Australians were not wrong by saying it's a pretty reasonable thing to actually get into China and determine the actual origins of COVID. And so they're not wrong on that. We're not wrong for being able to push that. And I know there are folks looking away and saying, okay, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. It does actually matter whether this was actually released from a laboratory in China and what that really means for the rest of the world and for so many of us that have lost loved ones during the time of COVID. It does matter on its origins. And it's just one more piece where the Chinese will just suppress information and will control their own people, even to the demise of their own people, to be able to manage from a top down, because they can't have the top look bad because they dominate their people and their society. Matt, I can't thank you enough for coming in to be able to have this dialogue and to be able to bring some light to this. We encourage folks to be able to find out more and more about China and to get past the PR and to be able to learn what it really means for whether you are Uyghurs in China that are living in basically concentration camps being retaught to be more Chinese, or whether that's how they control their press or their faiths or whatever it may be. People to be able to get on the other side of that and to be able to say, as Americans, it is important that we not only have that kind of freedom, but people around the world are able to live and practice that kind of freedom as well in their own life. We want what's good for us to be experienced by other people, and that doesn't happen when you've got a government with their thumb on you constantly to be able to manage and control. So, Matt, thanks for staying on top of these issues. Thanks for continuing to be able to communicate what you know, what you've researched for so many years, in the way that you do that.
Thanks, Senator. It's been a real honor to be with you.
Matt, glad to be able to do it. And for those of y'all that are still listening in on it, thanks for being a part of this conversation. As I mentioned at the very top of the conversation, you can always go to all of the major platforms that deal with all the podcasting subscriptions, Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, to be able to get the next episode when this comes out. We change topics every month as we go into some of the different topics of the day to be able to go a little bit deeper, to be able to give you some perspective. As we say, we like to make you the smartest kid at the water cooler in all of your normal conversations, or at this point, the smartest kid in your own conversation online nowadays. Glad to be able to be a part of this. Track us at lankford.senate.gov, lankford.senate.gov on our website. We'll have all the contact information for both email, phone numbers for all of our offices. And if you like actually doing a letter and buying a stamp, the post office loves it when you do that. Our snail mail address is even there as well if you want to be able to stay in contact with us. Look forward to the ongoing dialogue and getting a chance to hear your responses and your thoughts to this conversation about China today. God bless you. Thanks. Look forward to the conversation.